A little café in Asheville suddenly became a nationwide sensation, not for its coffee or pastries, but because of a mischievous raccoon named Benny. From his very first handshake to the moments that healed broken hearts, Benny turned ordinary encounters into small miracles. But no one expected that his final touch would change everything. Most mornings in Asheville start the same way in our little corner of the Blue Ridge. Soft light on the brick, a cool breath rolling down from the hills, and the rattle of trash cans as someone on the block forgets to secure a lid. Jack Miller never forgets. He's up before the birds, unlocking the side door of the cafe he and Linda built with their hands, letting the warm roast of the first drip roll out onto Walnut Street like a welcome mat. He moves a little slower than he used to, old firefighter knees, but there's a steadiness about him that makes the whole place feel safe. Inside, the cafe is simple on purpose. White mugs, scuffed maple floors, a chalkboard menu that always leans a hair to the left, no matter how many times Linda straightens it. Locals call it Miller's, though the sign over the door reads Ember Oak. Jack likes that name. It reminds him that even a burned forest seeds the ground for something green. The Raccoon showed up the year the ridge caught fire. It was an ugly week. Ash on cars, sirens in the night, a smell like a campfire that outstayed its welcome. Jack came home late one evening with soot in his hair and a shoebox tucked under his arm. Linda would remember the way he stood in the doorway, tired and wide-eyed, as if he was bringing home a secret he couldn't keep any longer. "Don't get mad," he said, and set the box on the kitchen table. Inside was a scrap of a thing, 2 bright eyes, a bandit mask, paws too small for the world. The little guy was singed around the whiskers and shaking so hard the box rattled. He didn't hiss. He didn't growl. He stared at Jack like a person might stare at a porch light after being lost in the dark. "He was under a deck," Jack said softly. "Mama didn't make it. He wouldn't let go of my glove." They warmed goat's milk on the stove and called the wildlife rehab number taped to the fridge. The woman on the line took their information, warned them not to name him, and promised to try for a pickup in the morning. The woman didn't make it until Thursday. By then, the scrap had a towel nest, a saucer with a dented rim he liked to push around with his nose, and a name he answered to whether he meant to or not. Benny. They were told the same thing everybody gets told about wild things that end up in kitchens. This is temporary. Don't get attached. Don't teach him bad habits. And for a while they listened. They kept Benny in a big dog crate at night, fed him on schedule, wore gloves. But there's only so much distance you can keep from a creature who decides your shoelaces are alive and in need of rescue. When the fire was finally contained and the hills wore a patchy shawl of black, the rehab tech came by, looked Benny up and down, and frowned, the kind of frown that means the news isn't cruel so much as practical. "He's young," she said, "and he's bonded. You did everything right. But sometimes they choose. He may never do well back out there." They tried a soft release anyway. Benny lasted a day, maybe 2. He came back dusty and proud, carrying a plastic bottle cap like treasure, and complaining loudly about the indignity of the neighbors' bungee cords on their trash can lids. By week's end, he'd learned the rhythm of the block. Garbage day on Wednesday, the baker's delivery at dawn, the exact squeak of Ember Oak's back door hinge. Jack finally said what was sitting on both their tongues. "We'll make it work." Making it work meant baby gates in odd places and a sturdy latch on the pastry case. It meant a bed behind the counter, fashioned out of an old fruit crate, and a fleece blanket Linda could never keep Benny from burrowing under. It meant notes to staff about raccoon etiquette, No sudden hands, no chips in paper bags. And for heaven's sake, watch your pens. Benny loved pens. He loved the click, the chase, the victory dance along the espresso machine, like a tiny parade marshal with a trophy. He was trouble, but he was good trouble. If you came in early enough, you might catch him with his mask smudged in a dusting of powdered sugar, guilty as a kid at Christmas. He'd pop up from behind the register like a jack-in-the-box, paws on the counter, head cocked, every line of him broadcasting the same thought. You didn't see anything. When Linda scolded him, he'd flop to the side and cover his face with both paws. Raccoon for, who, me, until even the mail carrier laughed. Benny learned the sound of the front bell and the weight of different footsteps. He learned that Henry, the retired postman from 3 doors down, always carried a peppermint in his shirt pocket and pretended he didn't. He learned that Mrs. Alvarez would leave the lid of her travel mug on the counter if she was running late, and it made the best spinning toy in Asheville. He learned that if you tapped a finger twice on the wood, Linda would look up from the bakery racks and smile at you, like you were the reason the sun had come up. Now and then, Benny got himself into the kind of scrape only Benny could invent. He wedged his head in the handle of a sugar scoop and paraded around like a knight. He toppled a stack of cardboard sleeves and wore one around his middle like a belt, strutting through the dining room to the increasing applause of 2 college kids and a contractor on break. He discovered the back alley trash cans and their mysterious bounties, and returned with a triumphant half of a foam takeout clamshell, which earned him a long bath and a stern talk Jack tried to deliver without laughing. But it was the counter that became his kingdom. From there he could see the door, the pastry case, the slow ballet of morning in a town that still said hello. He'd sit upright on his crate, paws neatly folded, eyes following the world with the wary curiosity of a creature who has known both smoke and safety. People started to talk. Have you been to the café with the Raccoon? He's got better manners than half the customers on Main. He'll look you in the eye, like he's measuring your soul. Nobody expected what happened the Tuesday after leaf season began. It was one of those bright, clean mornings when the maples out front looked lit from the inside. Jack was grinding beans. Linda was sliding a tray of apple hand pies into the case. Henry came in later than usual, hat in his hands, a softness in his face that made the room go quiet for a beat. He'd been tired lately, walking slower. He set $1 on the counter and stared at the pies like a man negotiating with himself. "Morning, troops," he said, but his voice had a frayed edge. Benny stood up. Not the usual curious lift, not the lazy stretch. He rose like he'd been called to attention. He looked at Henry's hands, then at Henry's eyes. His ears twitched. He placed one paw, careful, deliberate, on the counter. Then he reached across the wood and laid that small, clever hand right on top of Henry's. It wasn't a grab, not a swipe at the peppermint Henry always pretended not to have. It was a touch. Light. Intentional. The kind of touch that says, "I see you," without making a speech about it. Henry froze. Jack stopped mid-grind. The grinder whined down like a tired insect. Linda pressed a hand to her apron and felt her own eyes blur. "Well now," Henry whispered, smiling like a man remembering his first bike and his last porch swing at the same time. He turned his palm up. Benny left his paw there. Little black fingers spread, pads warm from the fleece. For a long second, nobody breathed. Then Benny did the most Benny thing of all. He glanced at the tip jar. It was a clear mason jar with a handwritten label. "Thanks, y'all," half full of 5s and coffee-stained ones. Benny looked at the jar, then back at Henry. He tapped his paw twice on Henry's palm, crisp as a knock on a door, and flicked his eyes toward the jar again. The café broke into laughter, the easy kind that cleans a room. Henry chuckled and dropped his dollar into the jar with a clink. Benny sat up straighter, satisfied. He pulled his paw back and folded both neatly like a gentleman who'd concluded the world's shortest business meeting. Word might have died right there between the hand pies and the chalkboard that won't sit straight, but the woman at the corner table had her phone out, and the contractor on break had his, and the college kids had 3. By lunch, a dozen little videos were bouncing around neighborhood group chats. By evening, the clip of the raccoon who asks for a tip had jumped the fence of the block and set off down the internet road with its tail high. Jack washed the cups and watched Benny sleep on his fleece, one paw draped over his nose as if the day had been too bright. "We didn't teach him that," he said quietly. "No," Linda answered, turning the chalkboard the other way as if it might finally settle. "He taught us." Out back, the alley hummed with the small life of a town exhaling, bikes ticking as they cooled, a screen door thudding, a lid properly secured on a can, because lessons get learned. The hills beyond the roofs were already blue with evening. The next morning, the bell over the door rang and kept ringing. A line formed that had nothing to do with coffee. People craned for a look at the counter, at the crate, at the little bandit with the bright eyes and the new trick they were sure wasn't a trick at all. Benny woke, stretched long as a question mark, and climbed to his post. He blinked at the crowd. He blinked at the jar. He blinked at Henry, who was back in his usual seat, peppermint present and accounted for. And then he did something nobody in the room was expecting, least of all Jack. He stood up on his hind legs and, without a sound, held out his paw to the first stranger in line. The line outside Ember Oak that Wednesday morning stretched past the bakery 2 doors down. Folks from the neighborhood had come curious, some with their grandkids, some with phones held ready, others with nothing but the quiet hope that what they'd heard wasn't just another internet exaggeration. A raccoon behind the counter, they said, one that reached out his paw like a polite little clerk. Jack didn't much like the attention. He'd spent years running into burning buildings, and he knew a flashover when he saw one. But Linda, with her steady smile and apron still dusted with flour, reminded him that the town wasn't laughing at them. They were gathering because they needed a story that made them feel good again. Jack supposed she was right. Asheville had seen its share of bad headlines lately, and a raccoon greeting customers at a corner cafe wasn't the worst thing to fill a paper. Benny, of course, seemed to thrive on it. He perched on his crate behind the register like a pint-sized judge, his ringed tail swishing back and forth, black masked eyes scanning each new arrival. He didn't offer his paw to everyone. Sometimes he sniffed the air and turned away, content to fold his hands like a tired bookkeeper. Other times he leaned forward, ears perked, and stretched out that clever hand with the poise of a seasoned salesman. The first stranger he greeted was a young mother with a toddler balanced on her hip. She set a crumpled dollar bill into the jar, and Benny, as if he'd rehearsed it all his life, pressed his paw gently against the back of her free hand. The room went silent for half a heartbeat, then filled with laughter and applause. The toddler clapped along, delighted. "Would you look at that?" Linda whispered. "He knows who to trust." Word spread faster after that. People began showing up not for coffee, but for the chance to earn Benny's handshake. Regulars didn't mind. They got their mugs filled and their usual smiles from Linda, and then they leaned back to watch the little drama play out. Henry, the retired mailman, returned that morning with his usual peppermint. Benny spotted him instantly, ears twitching like old friends exchanging a secret. This time, instead of just touching Henry's palm, Benny tapped twice and then looked squarely at his shirt pocket. Henry laughed until he wheezed and pulled out the candy. "You rascal," he said. "You put me out of business if I still had a root." That clip, an old man chuckling while a raccoon demanded a peppermint, ended up online by afternoon. By supper time it had more views than Jack wanted to count. He didn't own a computer, but his niece sent him the link. "Uncle Jack," she texted, "your raccoon is trending." That night, when the cafe was quiet and Benny snored softly in his crate, Jack sat at the counter and rubbed his temples. "He's not a sideshow," he murmured. "He's family." Linda set a hand on his shoulder. "Let's just see where this goes. Folks aren't laughing at him. They're touched by him. There's a difference." The difference became clear a few days later, when a group of college kids wandered in with their phones recording. They didn't order anything. They just crowded around the counter, waving their hands and snapping their fingers, trying to get Benny to perform. Benny cocked his head, unimpressed. One of the boys thought it would be funny to dangle a cookie just out of reach. In a flash, Benny leapt onto the boy's shoulder, snatched the cookie clean, and plopped the stolen treat into the tip jar, like he was making a deposit. The cafe roared with laughter. The boy turned red, and his friends caught every second on video. Jack wasn't sure if he wanted to scold the raccoon or shake his paw himself. "Good grief," Linda sighed, half exasperated, half proud. "He knows the jar better than we do." By the end of the week, Benny had a reputation. He wasn't just the raccoon who greeted customers. He was the raccoon who chose his moments, who ignored the loud and rewarded the gentle, who could sniff out a peppermint and steal a cookie for the house fund. One morning, a man in a suit came in. A stranger, not local, the kind of man who checked his watch more than he looked at people. He slapped a 20 on the counter and leaned down toward Benny, waggling his fingers. "Come on, pal, do the trick." The cafe hushed. Benny regarded the man coolly, then turned away and busied himself with the coffee stirrers. The man scowled, muttered something under his breath, and left his 20 behind. The jar clinked with the bill, but Benny never offered his paw. Later, Henry said what everyone else was thinking. "He's got better judgment than half the folks in this town." That became the new magic. Benny didn't greet everyone. He greeted the ones who slowed down, who spoke softly, who treated him like more than a gimmick. People noticed. They left the cafe not just with caffeine in their veins, but with a small reminder that kindness mattered, that patience was rewarded, that even a raccoon could tell the difference. Jack still worried. He knew fame could sour quick, and he wanted to protect the little fellow who had stumbled into their lives from a burning ridge. But watching Benny rest his paw in the hands of a widow who hadn't smiled since her husband passed, or gently tap the wrist of a child too shy to meet his eyes, Jack felt a weight lift he didn't even know he'd been carrying. One evening, as the last customer left and the streetlights blinked awake, Jack locked the front door and glanced back at the counter. Benny was there, paws folded, eyes bright in the dim. He looked, for all the world, like a shopkeeper waiting for tomorrow. "You know what you're doing, don't you?" Jack said. Benny blinked once, slow and deliberate, and then curled himself on the fleece blanket. The jar glimmered on the counter, stuffed with bills and coins. But that wasn't what mattered. What mattered was the silence in the room, warm and full, the kind that told Jack this raccoon had already changed more lives than he realized. And in the morning, when the bell rang again, Benny would be there, ready, waiting, and deciding with that clever little paw who had earned the gift of a handshake. By the time the leaves turned gold on the Blue Ridge and drifted down across the sidewalks of Asheville, the little cafe on Walnut Street was no longer just a place for coffee. Folks whispered about it in the grocery line. Pastors mentioned it from the pulpit, and high school kids told the story with the same awe they usually reserved for football scores. Ember Oak had become the home of a raccoon who shook hands and asked for tips. At first, the attention felt harmless. Families would drive in from nearby towns, order a slice of pie, and wait their turn near the counter. Some took pictures. Others whispered encouragements to their kids, but most simply watched Benny with a kind of childlike wonder that softened their faces. He picked who to greet and who to ignore, and his selectiveness only deepened the mystery. A handshake from Benny was something to brag about. Jack still worried, though. He'd spent his life studying the way flames spread. Quiet at first, then sudden, then unstoppable. Popularity, he figured, burned much the same way. The first sign of trouble came with the college kids. They arrived one Saturday afternoon, 4 of them, shoulders slung with backpacks and cameras already rolling. They didn't bother ordering coffee. They went straight to the counter, laughing too loud, their voices bouncing off the cafe's narrow walls. "Come on, buddy, do the trick," one of them called, snapping his fingers near Benny's face. Benny flattened his ears and shifted his weight, wary. Another boy pulled a cookie from his pocket and dangled it like bait. "Shake my hand and you get this." Before Jack could step in, Benny sprang. He climbed up the boy's arm, perched on his shoulder, and in one swift move, snatched the cookie clean. The café gasped. Then Benny hopped down, strutted across the counter with the swagger of a prizefighter, and dropped the cookie into the tip jar with a plunk. For a heartbeat, the room was silent. Then, laughter broke out, deep belly laughter that rolled through every corner. Even Jack couldn't stop the grin tugging at his face. The boy turned crimson, while his friends doubled over, catching it all on camera. That night, the video spread like wildfire. "Raccoon robs college kid for cookie," read the captions. By morning, it had been shared 100,000 times. Linda leaned over Jack's shoulder when their niece showed them the clip on her phone. "You can't tell me people aren't falling in love with him," she said. Jack rubbed the back of his neck. "Or they're laughing at him. There's a difference." But when he looked at Benny, asleep on his fleece bed with his paw curled under his chin, Jack saw none of the weariness of a creature put on display. Benny looked content, even smug, as if he knew exactly what he'd done and why. The weeks rolled on, and Ember Oak began to change. Lines formed earlier, tables filled faster, and the tip jar grew heavy by mid-morning. But not every new visitor came with kindness in their hearts. One afternoon, a man in a business suit pushed through the door. He looked out of place, his shoes too shiny, his voice too sharp for a café where regulars spoke in the soft cadence of neighbors. He pulled a crisp 20 from his wallet and slapped it down. "All right, Raccoon," he barked. "Let's see it." The café fell quiet. Benny lifted his head, sniffed the air, and then turned away, busying himself with a coffee stirrer. The man scowled, muttered something no one could quite hear, and stalked out without his change. The 20 remained in the jar, but the room stayed hushed for a long moment. Then Henry cleared his throat and said, "That raccoon's got better manners than most folks in this town." The tension broke and laughter returned, but Jack's chest stayed tight. That night he told Linda, "This is getting out of hand." But Benny, as if sensing his unease, hopped onto Jack's lap, pressed his paw against his chest, and stared up with eyes that seemed to say, "Trust me." Not long after, another twist of fate arrived. A local reporter wandered in, notebook in hand, eyes curious but kind. She watched Benny for an hour, ordered 2 coffees just to have a reason to stay, and left without a word. The next Sunday, a small article appeared in the Asheville paper. "The Raccoon Who Chooses." It wasn't the headline that stirred the town. It was the closing line. The reporter wrote, "He greets the patient, not the loud. He rewards the gentle, not the demanding. In a world quick to shout, this raccoon reminds us to whisper." The article struck a chord. Soon, visitors weren't just tourists with cameras. They were people looking for something deeper. A little hope, a little healing. A reminder that kindness still meant something. Still, not everyone understood. One evening, a group of young men showed up, rowdy and half-drunk. They pressed close to the counter, chanting for Benny to perform. He huddled low, ears back. Jack moved fast, shooing them out before it could go further. His hands shook afterward, and Linda wrapped her arm around him. "We need to protect him," she whispered. Jack nodded. "Before he burns out, or worse." But the very next morning, Benny surprised them all. A widow named Mrs. Carter shuffled in, her steps heavy with years. She slid a coin across the counter and whispered, "I haven't had anyone to shake my hand in months." Benny studied her for a long moment, then reached out, slow and deliberate. His paw rested against her hand, and her eyes filled with tears. The cafe was silent, every witness holding their breath. When Benny pulled back, Mrs. Carter whispered, "Thank you." The moment lingered, fragile and holy, before life resumed. Cups clinked, chairs scraped, but everyone knew they'd seen something more than a trick. That night, Jack finally understood what Linda had been saying. Benny wasn't just entertainment, he was a reminder, a mirror of who people were when they slowed down enough to listen. Still, Jack couldn't shake the unease in his gut. He'd lived long enough to know that when something spreads this fast, it rarely slows down on its own. The crowd would grow. The pressure would mount. And Benny, clever, stubborn, mischievous Benny, would have to decide how much of himself he could give before it became too much. Outside, the hills glowed under the last light of autumn. Inside, Benny dozed, one paw draped over his nose, the tip jar full beside him. And Jack, watching him breathe, whispered a promise he wasn't sure he could keep. "I'll keep you safe, little guy, no matter what comes next." By late October, Ember Oak no longer felt like the same sleepy cafe that Jack and Linda had run for years. Each morning, lines stretched out the door before the lights even flickered on. People brought children clutching stuffed animals, couples holding hands, and even travelers who had driven hours just to see the raccoon who chooses. The cash register hummed, the tip jar overflowed, but the air inside was different, thicker, louder, buzzing with expectation. Benny still sat on his crate behind the counter, paws folded, eyes scanning the crowd like a shopkeeper tallying customers. But Jack noticed the changes before anyone else. Benny's ears flicked back more often. His tail swished with impatience. He still shook hands, still tapped the tip jar. But sometimes he retreated to his blanket, sooner than before. Jack had seen the same look in firefighters after long nights, a weariness that seeps deeper than bones. One Saturday morning, the cafe was packed shoulder to shoulder. A group of out-of-town visitors had crammed near the counter, phones raised, voices loud. They jostled one another, shouting at Benny, as if volume alone could earn them a handshake. "Come on, do it! Over here, buddy!" A woman leaned so far across the counter that her purse knocked over a stack of sleeves. A teenager banged twice on the wood, as though Benny were a vending machine. Jack saw it happen. The way Benny flinched, ears pressed flat against his head, pupils blown wide. Then, without warning, Benny scrambled off his crate and bolted across the counter, claws clicking on the wood. He dove straight into a cardboard box stacked near the espresso machine and curled tight, only his ringed tail sticking out. The room fell awkwardly silent. Linda rushed forward, clapping her hands sharply. "That's enough, folks. He's not here for your circus. Everyone, step back." The crowd shuffled, embarrassed, some muttering apologies, others tucking their phones away. Henry, seated at his usual stool, tapped the counter softly and shook his head. "He's telling us he's tired. Anybody with eyes can see that." That night, after the last customer left and the chairs were turned on their sides, Jack sat at the counter with his head in his hands. Benny peeked out from his box, fur ruffled, eyes still wide. He padded over, climbed into Jack's lap, and placed his paw against Jack's chest, as if to steady him. "We pushed you too far," Jack whispered. "That's on us." Linda slid into the chair beside him. "We need to make rules, Jack. He can't be everything to everyone." So they made a plan. Starting Monday, Benny would only be available for handshakes twice a day, an hour in the morning, an hour in the afternoon. The rest of the time, a small rope barrier would be set up across the counter, with a hand-painted sign that read, "Benny is resting. Thank you." When Jack hung the sign that first morning, he half expected mutiny. But to his surprise, most people nodded, even smiled. A few grumbled, but Henry's steady presence near the counter, like a watchful grandfather, kept tempers cool. Of course, Benny had his own ideas. On Tuesday, just as the sign went up, the front bell jingled. A little boy in a red ball cap shuffled inside, holding his mother's hand. The cafe was quiet, not Benny's official working hours, but Benny poked his head up from the crate anyway. He blinked at the boy, stretched lazily, and then marched to the edge of the counter. Ignoring the barrier entirely, Benny reached out a paw. The boy gasped, giggled, and pressed his palm gently against Benny's fingers. The crowd of regulars cheered softly, and Jack sighed, rubbing his forehead. "Guess nobody tells him when he's off the clock," Linda murmured, half exasperated, half proud. Benny had always been mischievous. He rifled through napkin holders, learned how to pry open the lid of the sugar jar, and once dragged a paper receipt roll across the cafe like a streamer in a parade. But now his antics carried a sharper edge. He seemed to understand he had power over the room. When he chose someone, the cafe leaned forward. When he ignored someone, they deflated. One evening, a man in a leather jacket tried to coax Benny with a jingling set of keys. Benny tilted his head, then in one swift move, snatched the keys and dropped them into the tip jar. The cafe roared with laughter, but Jack caught the flicker of strain in Benny's eyes. That night, after closing, Jack told Linda, "He's clever enough to play the game, but I don't know how long he can keep it up." Linda pressed her hand over his. "Then it's our job to protect him, not from himself. He knows who he is, but from the people who want too much." Still, the cafe was changing. Customers lingered longer, hungry not just for coffee but for a connection they couldn't name. Some came with heavy hearts, drawn by word of mouth that Benny could sense what others missed. Others came with restless energy, eager for a viral clip. And in the middle of it all sat a raccoon with bright eyes, a striped tail, and a knack for choosing who deserved his paw. On a rainy Thursday, Jack found himself staring out the window at the wet street, the rope barrier in place, the sign swinging gently. Behind him, Benny sat alert, ears twitching at every bell chime. "Do you think he knows?" Jack asked quietly. Henry, sipping his coffee at the counter, didn't hesitate. "Course he knows. He knows when folks need him, and he knows when they don't. Question is, can the rest of us learn the same?" The cafe hummed with quiet agreement. Benny turned, padded across the counter, and tapped his paw against the jar once, twice, his way of reminding everyone that he was still in charge. Jack exhaled, half a laugh, half a prayer. For all his mischief, Benny was teaching them something none of them could put into words yet. That kindness had limits, that even joy needed rest. And that sometimes the bravest thing a creature can do is hide in a cardboard box and remind the world, I am not yours to command. And in that reminder lay the beginning of something deeper than a handshake or a tip jar, something Jack knew would only grow heavier in the days ahead. The rain had cleared overnight, leaving the streets of Asheville washed and glistening, the air sharp with the smell of wet leaves. Ember Oak opened as usual, the bell above the door chiming softly as Jack turned the key and Linda pulled trays of pumpkin muffins from the oven. Benny, curled on his fleece, yawned wide enough to show his tiny teeth, then padded to his post behind the counter. His eyes sparkled as if he knew the morning would bring something different. By now, folks understood the rhythm. Benny was available in the mornings from 10 to 11, then again in the afternoon for an hour. The rest of the day belonged to coffee, chatter, and the quiet heartbeat of a neighborhood café. Jack had learned to watch Benny closely, ready to pull the rope barrier across whenever the raccoon's ears flattened or his tail flicked with irritation. Protecting Benny had become second nature, like watching the fire line years ago. Constant, alert, knowing a flare-up could happen any time. It was late morning when the bell jingled again. A woman stepped inside, shoulders stooped under a damp coat, her eyes shadowed by sleepless nights. Beside her stood a little girl, maybe 8 years old, small for her age, with dark hair that clung to her cheeks. She held her mother's hand tightly, as though letting go might mean losing more than she could bear. Jack glanced at Linda, and she gave him the smallest nod. The cafe hushed without being told. "This is Sophie," the woman said softly, almost apologetically. She doesn't talk much these days, but she loves animals." Her voice cracked at the edges, and she smoothed the girl's hair with a trembling hand. "We lost her father last spring." The words landed heavy in the room. Even the regulars looked down at their cups. Loss had touched them all in one way or another, but to see it weighing on a child, that was different. Sophie didn't speak. She didn't even look around the cafe. Her gaze was fixed on the floor, her shoulders drawn up like a shield. But Benny had noticed her the moment she stepped in. His ears perked, his head tilted, and he rose from his crate. He didn't care about the schedule, or the sign, or the rope barrier strung across the counter. Benny climbed down, one careful step at a time, until he stood at the edge of the wood, eyes locked on the small figure beside her mother. The cafe held its breath. "Benny," Linda whispered, but she didn't stop him. The raccoon stretched his paw forward, not at the mother, not at anyone else. At Sophie, the girl froze. For a moment it seemed she might shrink back, tuck herself tighter into her mother's side. But something in Benny's stillness drew her. He didn't lunge, didn't chatter, didn't beg. He just held his paw there, waiting. Slowly, Sophie lifted her hand. It shook as it rose, fingers curled tight. She hesitated an inch away. "Go ahead, sweetheart," her mother whispered, tears already in her eyes. Sophie uncurled her fingers and touched Benny's paw. The change was instant. Her posture softened. Her shoulders lowered. Her face, usually so guarded, broke into the smallest, most genuine smile. For the first time in months, a spark of childhood returned. She let out a shaky laugh, a sound her mother hadn't heard since before the accident, and whispered, "Hi, Benny." The room went still. Then, quietly, Henry cleared his throat and muttered, "Would you look at that?" The little girl's hand stayed in Benny's paw longer than most. Benny didn't pull away. He seemed to understand she needed more. He leaned closer, placing his other paw gently against her wrist, holding her as if she were the only person in the world. Her mother pressed a hand to her mouth, sobbing softly. Linda's eyes filled, and even Jack, Steady old firefighter Jack felt his throat tighten. When Sophie finally let go, she turned to her mother with bright eyes. "Mom," she said clearly, "he's funny." The café erupted in quiet applause, not the raucous kind, but the kind meant to honor something sacred. Benny blinked, then tapped his paw twice against the counter, as if sealing the moment. From that day, Sophie and her mother became regulars. They sat in the corner booth every Tuesday and Thursday, sipping cocoa, while Sophie waited patiently for Benny. Unlike most children, she never rushed him, never squealed or grabbed. She sat perfectly still until Benny chose to come to her. And he always did. Jack noticed how Benny's demeanor shifted with her. He could be mischievous with college kids, sly with Henry, stubborn with strangers, but with Sophie, he was gentle, almost solemn. He seemed to sense the weight she carried and offered not tricks, but presence. Word spread, as it always did. People whispered about the little girl who had spoken again because of a raccoon. Families arrived with children of their own, some shy, some carrying burdens invisible to the world. Not all of them connected the way Sophie did, but everyone left with the sense that Benny wasn't just performing, he was choosing. One evening, after closing, Jack found Benny curled in his fleece, eyes half closed. He sat beside him, tired but grateful. "You know you're doing more than we ever could, don't you?" he murmured. "You're giving folks something we can't." Benny blinked slowly, then stretched out his paw and placed it on Jack's arm. The same gesture he had given Sophie, the same gesture he had given Henry, a raccoon's way of saying, "I know." Jack exhaled and leaned back. Outside, the street was quiet. The rain gone, the air smelling of wood smoke. Inside, the little café glowed warm, carrying a secret larger than itself. In that moment, Jack understood. Ember Oak wasn't just a café anymore. It had become a refuge. And at the heart of it was a striped-tailed bandit who greeted strangers not with words, but with a paw that could mend what grief had broken. Tomorrow, the bell would ring again, and Benny would choose. But tonight, in the quiet, Jack whispered a promise to the little raccoon sleeping soundly on his fleece. "We'll keep you safe, Benny. No matter how many come. You're not just ours anymore. You're theirs too." The story of Sophie and Benny did not stay within the walls of Ember Oak for long. Asheville was a small town, the kind where a haircut, a good pie, or a sad bit of news traveled faster than the buses. Within a week, neighbors were whispering about the little girl who had smiled again because of a raccoon's paw. Within 2, people were driving from counties away. Some brought children, others carried quiet grief of their own. But all came with the same question in their eyes. Could Benny choose them too? Jack saw it in the way folks lingered at the counter, hands hovering over the tip jar, waiting. He saw it in the way couples touched each other more gently, in the way lonely men and women stood taller when Benny acknowledged them. The cafe was busier than it had ever been, but there was something else humming beneath the bustle. Something fragile, something healing. On a bright morning, a young couple came in, faces drawn with the kind of weariness Jack knew wasn't from lack of sleep alone. They ordered coffee, sat close together, and whispered in tones that carried more sorrow than hope. When Benny leapt down from his crate and walked across the counter toward them, the room hushed. He tapped his paw against the man's wrist, and then against the woman's. She gasped softly, tears welling in her eyes. Later, Linda overheard them say they had been struggling for years to have a child, and for the first time in months, they felt seen. The café began to fill with these kinds of moments. A widower who hadn't spoken much since his wife's funeral chuckled when Benny stole a sugar packet from his saucer. A teenager wrestling with his place in the world smiled shyly when Benny placed his paw on his notebook, as if giving his blessing to the words scribbled inside. It wasn't just about the handshake anymore. It was about the way Benny reminded people they mattered. But with the wonder came a tension Jack hadn't bargained for. One Tuesday afternoon, a reporter from the local paper returned, notepad in hand, and asked Linda if she could sit in the corner and observe.
"It's not just a novelty anymore," she explained. "People are saying Benny is changing lives. That's something the world should hear." Jack frowned. He'd seen how fire spread when oxygen was added, and he worried Benny's quiet gift would be smothered under too much noise. But Linda, gentle as ever, said, "Maybe the world needs a reminder of kindness." The article that followed was simple, even tender. It described the widow, the young couple, Sophie. It ended with a line that struck deeper than Jack expected. "In a world quick to demand, Benny reminds us to wait. In a world loud with noise, he teaches us to listen." After that, Ember Oak changed again. Visitors no longer came just for the trick of a raccoon pawing at a jar. They came because they believed Benny could touch something inside them that had gone quiet, and sometimes he did. Still, not every moment was pure. One afternoon, a pair of young men came in with cameras.
They spoke loudly about getting the perfect viral shot and nudged each other toward the counter. Benny stayed in his crate, ears flat, body taut. When one of the men tried to reach over the rope, Benny hissed sharply and retreated to the back corner. The cafe went cold with silence until Jack stepped forward, voice steady as a man who had once barked orders through fire. "That's enough," he said, pulling the rope tighter. "If you're here to mock him, you can leave. This isn't a circus." The young men slunk out, but the tension lingered. Henry shook his head from his stool. World doesn't always know what to do with something real. Yet Benny seemed to know. The very next day, during a quiet afternoon, Sophie returned with her mother. She sat at the counter, hands folded neatly, waiting. Benny climbed down and placed both paws on her arm. Sophie looked into his eyes, then into her mother's, and whispered, "I think he knows I'm better now." Her mother cried, the kind of cry that cleans a soul, and Jack, wiping down the counter with a rag, pretended not to see his own eyes blur. That evening, after the cafe emptied, Jack sat alone with Benny. The raccoon stretched out on his fleece, tail curled neatly, paws tucked under his chin. "You're carrying more than we ever asked of you," Jack murmured, "and yet you keep giving." Benny opened one eye, reached out his paw, and tapped Jack's hand twice. The same gesture he used with the jar, the same one he used with strangers who needed reminding they mattered. Jack chuckled softly. "Yeah, I get it. You're still the one in charge." Outside, the street lamps flickered on, and the town settled into its evening rhythm. Inside, the cafe glowed with something greater than coffee and pie. It had become a place of refuge, a place where a mischievous raccoon with a bandit's mask taught lessons people had forgotten how to learn. The power of Benny's touch wasn't just in the handshake. It was in the way he chose, patiently, deliberately, who needed him most. And though Jack worried about the weight of it all, he also knew one thing for certain. Benny wasn't just changing strangers. He was changing them too. Tomorrow, the bell would ring again. Tomorrow, another story would unfold. And Benny, clever little bandit that he was, would be ready with his paw, reminding the world that even in its noise and rush, there was still room for quiet kindness. By mid-November, the crisp air carried more than the smell of wood smoke and wet leaves. It carried rumors, whispers that had traveled well beyond Asheville. The story of a raccoon who shook hands, who seemed to heal hearts, had spread across county lines, across the state, and now across the country.
It was only a matter of time before the cameras followed. Jack saw the first news van before the bell even chimed that morning. White letters stretched across the side. Channel 7. A young woman with bright eyes and a microphone stepped out, followed by a man hauling a tripod. Behind them came another van, and then another. Before long, the narrow street outside Ember Oak was jammed with cables, microphones, and people adjusting their jackets in the reflection of the cafe window. Inside, the regulars watched in uneasy silence. Henry muttered, "Feels like a parade nobody asked for." Linda pressed a hand to her apron, worry flashing in her eyes. Jack tried to keep his face steady, but his gut told him this was the kind of fire you couldn't control once it caught. Benny noticed too. He sat high on his crate, tail twitching, ears forward, his black-masked eyes flicking from the door to Jack and back again. He knew something was different.
The first reporter, a woman named Sarah, entered carefully. She had the good sense to move slow, to speak softly. "We've heard about your raccoon," she said. "We'd like to share his story." Jack started to protest, but Linda touched his arm. "If they're careful, maybe it's not such a bad thing." So Sarah sat up near the counter, the cameras humming, the lights too bright for a place that had always belonged to shadows and sunbeams. Customers whispered, phones hovered, and Benny, curious as ever, leaned forward. "May I?" Sarah asked, holding out a small biscuit. Jack nodded reluctantly. Sarah crouched low, extended her hand. Benny sniffed, then placed his paw gently on her fingers. But instead of pulling back, he held it there. The cafe fell silent. Sarah's eyes filled with tears. Into the microphone, her voice shook. "This isn't just a raccoon greeting customers. This is a bridge between worlds." The clip aired that Sunday night. By Monday morning, Ember Oak was a destination. Cars lined the block with license plates from Tennessee, Georgia, even Ohio. Families poured in, some driving hours for the chance to meet the bandit-eyed creature who seemed to see into souls. At first, Jack tried to manage it. They set up a sign-up sheet, 5 minutes with Benny, 2 sessions a day. Folks grumbled but accepted the rules. For a time, it worked. The cafe stayed busy but not unbearable. Benny greeted with patience, shook hands with grace, and retreated to his fleece when the hour was done. But the flood never stopped. One morning, 3 vans parked outside before sunrise. Inside, a group of teenagers crowded the counter, their phones flashing. They weren't there for cocoa or pie. They were there for the clip. "Get closer," one hissed, pushing past the rope. Benny flattened his ears, tail bristling. Jack moved fast, his voice sharp. "Out. Now. He's not here for your circus." The kids laughed, but they left, their sneakers squeaking across the wet sidewalk. Still, the damage was done. Benny slunk back into his crate, eyes wary, paws tucked tight. That night, Jack sat at the kitchen table long after closing, staring at the ledger. The cafe had never made more money, but he felt no joy. Linda set a cup of tea in front of him and said gently, "We're losing what made this place special." He nodded. It was never about money. It was about the moments. The quiet ones. As if to prove her right, the very next day brought one of those moments. It was a grey Tuesday afternoon. The cafe was calmer than usual, the sign across the counter marking Benny's rest time. The door opened, and in walked a grandmother and a small girl with dark curls. The woman's eyes looked tired but kind. She guided the girl to the counter, speaking softly. "This is Emma," she said. She's 7. She's different. She doesn't talk much.
She gets too excited with animals, so they run away. Jack frowned. It's not Benny's session right now. But Benny was already watching. He rose from his fleece, stretched long, and walked to the edge of the counter. Emma stood perfectly still, eyes locked on him. For a moment, they simply stared at each other, two creatures measuring the space between them. Then Benny did something he had never done before. He climbed down, closer, and extended his paw, not over the counter, but out toward Emma's tiny hand. Emma lifted her hand slowly, as though in a dream. The second their fingers touched, her stiff posture softened. Her lips parted, and then, clear and small, she said, "Thank you, Benny." Her grandmother gasped. Linda covered her mouth. Jack felt tears burn his eyes before he could stop them. The moment lasted longer than any handshake before. Benny didn't pull away. He stayed with Emma until her smile widened, until the cafe's silence was full of something holy. When she finally stepped back, her grandmother wept openly. "She's never spoken like that, not in months." Benny blinked, then returned to his crate, curling up as if nothing extraordinary had happened. But everyone in the room knew otherwise. That night, as Jack locked the door and the street settled into quiet, he looked back at Benny. The raccoon stirred, lifted his head, and tapped his paw twice against the wood. Jack nodded. He understood. The world could bring cameras, reporters, and crowds. But the heart of it, the thing that mattered, wasn't the fame. It was Emma. It was Sophie. It was the quiet miracle of a small paw, placed exactly where it was needed. And though the noise outside would only grow louder, Jack vowed then and there that he would fight to keep Benny's gift from being smothered. Because what they had wasn't a spectacle. It was grace, hidden in fur and whiskers, teaching the world one hand at a time. Winter crept into Asheville gently, the way it always did in the mountains. The air sharpened, leaves gave way to bare branches, and the first thin dusting of snow clung to rooftops. Inside Ember Oak, the warmth of the ovens and the smell of cinnamon carried through the rooms. Regulars bundled in scarves and gloves, bringing with them stories of holidays and long drives. But no story in town carried weight like Benny's. The raccoon had become more than a curiosity. He was a neighbor, a comfort, a healer. Families came from states away, but they came quietly now. Jack and Linda had learned to set boundaries. 2 sessions a day, 5 minutes each, no flash photography. To their surprise, people respected the rules. Perhaps it was because Benny himself enforced them. If he was tired, he would turn away, retreating to his fleece. If someone was loud or pushy, he would sit still, paws folded, until the message was clear. Respect, or nothing at all. Through it all, Benny remained mischievous. He still tugged pens from shirt pockets, still pawed through napkin holders, still dragged sugar packets into his crate like trophies. He could make a room laugh with nothing but a tilt of his head. But there was something more in him now, a kind of wisdom. He chose his moments carefully, and when he extended his paw, everyone knew it meant more than play. One crisp evening, the cafe was nearly empty. Snowflakes drifted outside, catching in the glow of the street lamps. Henry sat at his usual stool, peppermint in hand. Sophie was there too, sipping cocoa with her mother, her laughter softer now, but steady, like a song finding its way back. Emma and her grandmother had come down from out of town, joining the circle of regulars who no longer felt like customers, but like family. Benny sat on his crate,
eyes half-lidded, tail curled neatly. He had been quiet all day, offering only a few handshakes. Jack worried at first, but when he saw the way Benny studied the room, as if memorizing every face, he let the silence stand. Then, slowly, Benny rose. He stretched, padded across the counter, and stopped before Henry. He placed his paw gently on the old man's hand, as he had so many mornings before. Henry chuckled, eyes misting. "Well now, aren't you a gentleman?" Next, Benny moved to Sophie. She grinned and set down her cup. He rested both paws on her arm, holding her gaze until she giggled. "You're still funny," she whispered, just as she had the first time. Then to Emma. She stood perfectly still, her grandmother's hand on her shoulder. Benny touched her palm, lingered, and Emma spoke clearly. "Thank you, Benny." The café was silent, wrapped in the kind of stillness that makes time pause. Jack felt Linda's hand slip into his. Finally, Benny turned back to the counter where Jack stood. His eyes, bright and deep, locked on the man who had carried him from a burning ridge years ago. He stepped forward, climbed the last few inches, and placed both paws on Jack's chest. Jack froze. He felt the warmth of Benny's paws through his shirt, the steady pressure of a creature that had never belonged to the wild or to captivity, but had carved out a place in between. For a long moment, Benny held there, eyes searching Jack's as if to say everything words never could. Then he tapped twice, the way he always did with the tip jar. A reminder, a promise. Jack's throat tightened. He whispered, "I hear you, little guy. I hear you." That night, after the café closed and the last chairs were stacked, Jack and Linda sat by the fire with Benny curled between them. Outside, snow fell thicker, blanketing the quiet street. Inside, warmth and peace settled like a quilt. They knew the crowds would return tomorrow. They knew the cameras would try again, the stories would keep spreading, but in that moment, none of it mattered. Benny wasn't a headline or a spectacle. He was family. He was Grace, wrapped in fur and whiskers, choosing, again and again, to reach across the space between species, between sorrow and hope, with nothing more than a paw. As the fire crackled, Jack whispered, "We'll keep you safe, no matter how loud the world gets." Benny stirred, stretched one paw out, and rested it gently on Jack's hand, his last gesture of the day, and in that simple touch lay everything: mischief, healing, love, and the reminder that sometimes the smallest creatures carry the greatest gifts. Tomorrow, the bell would ring again. Tomorrow, new faces would line the counter, eager for a handshake, and Benny, clever little bandit of Asheville, would be there, choosing once more who needed his paw, one touch at a time. If this story touched you, drop a simple 1 in the comments so we know you're here with us. And don't forget to hit subscribe, because Benny's story is just one of many, and the next one might be the one you'll never forget.